Hi, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Om-gnosis, the Occult South Asia podcast. I am Dr. Keith Edward Cantú, a research affiliate at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard Divinity School. And I am very excited about this episode today to introduce you to two of the founders or coiners of this phrase, Occult South Asia. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and please do like or subscribe to the Center's initiatives and YouTube page if you get a chance, and look forward to sharing with you new content in the future. Thanks. Today I have the privilege to be joined by Karl Baier, who is Professorial Research Fellow at the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Vienna. And he had also acted as the head of the Department of Religious Studies there between 2013 and 2020. And Professor Baier holds an MA in Catholic theology and a PhD in philosophy. And from 1987 to 2009, he was a postdoctoral research assistant and assistant professor at the Department of Christian Philosophy at the University of Vienna, and has published many books and articles related to 19th and 20th century alternative religion, mesmerism, occultism, modern yoga research, and psychedelics. And then I'm joined by Dr. Mriganka Mukhopadhyay, who is a postdoctoral fellow and lecturer at the Center for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam, very well-known institution in the world of esotericism. And he completed a BA and MA from Presidency College in Kolkata, as well as an MPhil from Ambedkar University in Delhi, and wrote his doctoral dissertation on occultism in the Orient, dissemination of the theosophical ideas in Bengal, which focuses on the theosophical movement in Bengal. And his interests range across Theosophy, modern history of occultism and esotericism, modern Hindu studies, Indian nationalism, and several aspects of intellectual and cultural histories in the 19th and 20th centuries. And I am inviting you all, since you all had convened the Occult South Asia workshop in Vienna in November of 2018, and originally are the pioneers of this category. But before we get into that, I'd like to hear a little more about your background. And so maybe we can start with Professor Baier. If you could tell me a little bit about your background, including what led you to the study of alternative religious movements and the role of meditation in these movements, including as expressed in your groundbreaking publications like Meditation und Moderne.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to talk with you. After graduating from high school, I relocated to Vienna primarily to study yoga with the teacher of my German yoga teacher. So my main goal was to become a yoga teacher. And at the same time, I started to study, as you already said, cultural anthropology, philosophy, and later Catholic theology. But I became a yoga teacher in the Iyengar School of Yoga. And working in this field, I was, of course, always in touch with alternative religion and spirituality in Vienna and in Germany. And so that was one reason for becoming interested, but into occultism and alternative religion. And in the year 2000, I became a designer and head of a postgraduate course in spirituality and interreligious dialogue at the University of Salzburg. That was a postgraduate program with a blend of theoretical courses and practical experience in the and that made me change my perspective on my academic career. I was fascinated by the topic of spirituality, spiritual practices, and looking at theology from a yoga teacher's point of view, so to say.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
And so I decided to write my habilitation thesis on spirituality. And first, it should have been more a theoretical grounding of the concept of spirituality. And I chose meditation as an example to base my ideas on spirituality historically via a history of meditation. So I entered the field of meditation studies, the study of history of meditation in Europe, and especially in the 19th and 20th century. And that brought me, in a way, deeper into the field of occultism. Why? I touched occultist topics already in my first book, which is on the history of reception of yoga in the West. That was primarily a MA thesis on the reception history of yoga. And of course, I stumbled over Madame Blavatsky and Vivekananda and so on. Yeah.
Right.
I didn't like what I read. In the beginning, I found it awful, difficult to read. Yeah. So
Sure.
I was in a negative mood towards these issues. But they reappeared when I started to study the history of meditation. And it came into my mind that around 1900, many people who write about yoga and meditation, they use terms like auto-suggestion, suggestion, hypnosis. And I asked myself, why are they conceptualizing meditation via autosuggestion and hypnosis? I went back to the founder of modern hypnosis, James Braid, and he, in the 1840s or so, wrote an article on yogis and hypnosis. I asked myself, why is he speaking about yogis in 1840s in connection with hypnosis? And he quotes some German mesmerists.
Okay.
I had no idea of mesmerism and its connection to yoga and meditation and yogis. But I started to read the mesmeric literature that James Braid quotes. And I was very astonished to see that German mesmerists at the beginning of the 19th century had knowledge of yoga and interpreted yogic meditation practices by concepts from mesmerism.
Sure.
So that was my real entrance into alternative religion and occultism in the 19th century. Because then I saw that the mesmeric literature was read by spiritists and by occultists in the USA and elsewhere. And this was my entrance to Blavatsky and the Isis Unveiled, because I saw a mesmeric structure of thought in this chaos. And that made it understandable for me. So that was my door to Theosophy via mesmerism. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, well, that's a great segue then, I think, into Mriganka, your background dealing with Theosophy sort of more from the Indian side, correct?
Yes, of course. Well, to begin with, first of all, thanks for having us. And
Of course.
congratulations on hosting this podcast series for several past few months or more than a year, if I'm not
Hmm.
wrong. And I have been following some of your episodes and have been really enjoying what I watch. So it's good to see you in this new avatar of an interviewer,
There you go. It's a
a
privilege
scholar
to
come
have you.
interviewer. Fantastic. Yeah. Speaking of my background, so my interest on theosophy or occultism or anything related to the field of esotericism research is purely academic. So I have never been associated to any theosophical society or any kind of esotericist organization for that matter.
Mm,
Uh, I studied history back in India, in Calcutta and in Delhi. And if you are trained as a historian, if you are studying history of modern India, then you cannot uh, avoid reading the chapters on history of Indian national movement, Indian freedom struggle in the
mm,
19th and 20th century. And every student of history, while going through those chapters, would encounter the names of course, Blavatsky, of course, Alcott, but also Annie Besant,
mm,
Alan Octavian Hume. And
mm,
then those old textbooks of history would say that there are some figures called Mahatmas who gave access to certain secret files to Alan Octavian Hume, and he was the one who thought of establishing the Indian National Congress. So these kind
mm,
of old theories that would give some intriguing connections about Theosophical Society and the Indian national movement. So that was my first entry point to the Theosophical Society. So I was interested in political history, I was interested in social history, intellectual history, and that's how I came to the Theosophical Society. Then some
mm,
of my professors in Calcutta and also in New Delhi, like they also suggested me like it might be a good idea to look into the connections between India and Europe in the context of the Theosophical Society,
right.
uh, and also to look into the questions of race,
Mm,
Aryanism, and how the Theosophical Society is involved into these questions. These are
mm,
very significant political historical questions.
mm-hmm,
And that's how my interest to the Theosophical Society began. When I was completing my master's, I was starting my MPhil. So I was in between New Delhi and Calcutta.
okay.
And interestingly, I went to Presidency College, as you mentioned in the introduction. Uh, the Bengal Theosophical Society, the one of the oldest lodges of the Theosophical Society, is located in the same neighborhood of Presidency College.
Oh, wow, I didn't
So
know
I
that.
had quite an easy access to the old building of the Bengal Theosophical Society while I was, just starting my research into the Theosophical Society. And I got to see some of those archival materials very early in my research stage. I haven't yet begun my PhD by then.
Mm,
But then I decided that this could be a important area, an interesting area where I would like to advance my research on and look into the connections, the transcultural encounters between India and the Western world
mm,
in the context of the Theosophical Society. So I started looking up for PhD opportunities, and eventually I landed up in Amsterdam um, and HHP Center. This was in 2017. I was introduced to the works of some of the leading scholars of the field of esotericism studies, Walter Hanecroft, Mukhopadhyay, but also some of the important scholars of religious studies, global religious history, Michel Burgunder, Julian Struber, a scholar whom I did not know much at that point, called Professor Karl Baier. He contacted me once on academia.edu when I
okay.
was yet to start my PhD and told me, I read one of your published papers. I found it very interesting that somebody is talking about the Bengali Theosophists. I thought like this is really big. Somebody, like a scholar from Vienna is contacting this nobody, a grad student in Calcutta.
Mm,
So I was really encouraged, and I was yet to meet him. We would eventually meet in Erfurt in 2017, and that would start to set the ball rolling for Occult South Asia. So I would come to that later on. But what I am trying to say, the bottom line is theosophical history became my entry point to occultism and esotericism. And then eventually it became a bigger entry point to the field of religious studies and plenty of other things. And after all these 8 years or around 9 years of being associated with the field of esotericism studies, I'm still here. So I think there is a lot to learn, a lot to do in terms of esotericism studies and Occult South Asia and theosophical movement. Every day when I go through those archival materials, I realize that there is still a lot to learn. I haven't scratched through even like 1/3 of the research materials what I have. So the academic interest continues, and I hope it will continue in the eventual years.
Yeah, so the portal was opened and you sort of walked through, and there's still a lot to look for. Yeah,
the hidden world,
the hidden world, right? The world beyond. Well, that's a good segue to this next question that I have for you, which is, the subtitle of the podcast is based on the workshop at the University of Vienna that I mentioned, for which both you, Mriganka, and Karl Baier, you coined the phrase Occult South Asia. To my knowledge, that phrase was never used before. And so I'm curious, in your own words, what is Occult South Asia, and how is it beneficial to study occult, this idea of the hidden or secret, and South Asia in combination rather than separately?
Well, okay, let me start by saying what I don't understand as occult.
Yes.
For me, it does not refer to an umbrella term for esoteric, mystical, secretive, spiritual traditions originating in South Asia. And South Asia means India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Tibet, Bangladesh, and Pakistan. So I don't mean secret traditions and mystical teachings in this area when I speak of Occult Asia. Instead, for me, it designates a field of interaction in which Western alternative religious movements engaged with South Asian traditions and vice versa. This encounter gave rise to new interpretations of old scriptures. Also, new concepts came up and practices and forms of religious experimentation, while simultaneously reshaping the self-understandings, social positions and modes of practice of all involved groups. So, I mean, this is what nowadays is called an entangled history.
Okay.
And Eastern agents who, through interactions, are changed. Both sides undergo a transformation in the process. And the name for this process for me is Occult South Asia.
So a process rather than an umbrella term.
And not India receiving teachings from Western esotericism, nor Western esotericism is informed by Eastern traditions, but the action that changes the identity of both, if there was one before, but it's an identity building through encounter that takes place.
Similar to, I know you've written about intercultural transfers before. Is it?
Yes. This concept came into my mind first off while I was writing my book on the reception of yoga. And through the it is a book on reception history, but in the course of my studies, I found that you cannot describe what's happening with yoga in the 19th century as a reception history. Because what the Indian traditions, yoga traditions, were already changed through impact of Western developments, ideas, and so on. And then other influences. So the East was not East anymore, and the West not really West. The category started to slide when I looked at the history of yoga in the 19th century. And so, yeah, Occult South Asia is from the very start a project that takes into consideration that it's a reception history is not enough. We have to look at these entanglements. Yeah.
Okay, Mriganka, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I more or less agree with what Professor Baier said. And there is one term I think is very crucial here, which also shaped my understanding, is transculturality. And the transcultural engagements between the Western society, the Western world, and the South Asian cultural space. And this engagement or entanglement between the two worlds actually shaped the Occult South Asia, or the understanding of these kind of global networks, So the historical actors from one part of the other were engaging with each other, having dialogues with each other, and they were influencing each other's thought patterns, if we can say it like that. And they were also building networks. These were cultural, intellectual, religious networks, political networks. And these network building process eventually shaped history of religions, history of occultism in a very global pattern. It does not mean there was a diffusion, and many of our colleagues would agree with that. There was no diffusion from west to east, neither from east to west, but it was a dialogue. It was a combined cultural entanglement that shaped this global, growth in a way of religion, in a very complex way. So, of course, the West was involved, South Asia was involved, but there were other cultural, political, religious, social spaces like Japan or Africa. Many other regions were also very much involved, and actors of these regions also encountered each other's, and they influenced each other's thoughts. And that's why I think also for many of the esotericist organizations, or occultist organizations for that matter, it could be the Theosophical Society, it could be various yogic groups, it could be various Vedantic associations, which were very global. So yoga became global. Of course, Theosophical Society was one of the channels, but what Vivekananda and his Ramakrishna mission was doing all across the world, that was also another channel. There were several Western yogis who were traveling to India, or Indian mystics traveling to the West. And these physical travels were also, helping to develop the networks around the world. So I think while South Asia is a very important geographical location, but it's also not just a geographical location. It's also a theme of study, and various currents, religious ideas and movements which are apparently seen as South Asian, for example, yoga, are not, this might sound a bit controversial, confusing, are not entirely South Asian. So they have been shaped also by various Western agents and influences. So yoga have a lot of Western influences. Similarly, several so-called Western esoteric ideas, for example, magic, how we see it in today's times in the study of esotericism research, that has been shaped by various Indian ideas.
Mm,
So these mutual influences are very important. And South Asia, as I said, like it's just not a geographical location in this context. It's a theme of
mm,
study.
mm. And that's, you got into that at the workshop a little bit with this category of despatialization as well, Mriganka, which I thought was really interesting. And the idea of sort of,
I played with that idea,
detaching.
yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah, I played with that idea, but eventually, yeah, I did not go too farther with that. Yeah, yeah.
Well, to be continued. In any case, I'm curious how sort of the emphasis on entanglements or sort of occult South Asia as a process, can help sort of scholars pay closer attention to marginalized figures and movements, and can also possibly help to nuance post-Orientalist critiques and kind of these rigid East-West binaries. I mean, you all have both touched on that a little bit, but it's clear that, there's a certain kind of tendency, within post-colonial studies to sort of, I think dismiss a lot of these transfers as sort of limited to, power or limited to, political formations. And I'm wondering, is there a way in which the study of occult South Asia can help nuance some of these discussions and debates and so on,
Mhm. Well, should I start again?
Please do. Yes, yes.
Sure.
Uh, well, yes, of course. The creating a field like Occult South Asia uh, brings up new literature, new people, new groups that were not really focused on by research in former times.
Mm,
And for example, Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy, or magical groups of different sorts, were not really taken seriously in the history of religion
mm,
for a long time. Esotericism research changed this,
mm,
but this also changes our view of the colonial history of India. And many people who were not known at all suddenly play an important role and
mm.
are seen as important. For example, your Swabhabati Swami, the whom you studied extensively, yeah, was completely unknown, except some specialists and magical groups who knew him. Yeah, but he was
And
not
and Dr. Karl Baier, you wrote about him. Yes.
covered in archives of the Theosophical Society in Chennai.
There you go.
Literally. Yeah. So this is something that shows that esotericism studies in general and occult South Asia studies discover new discourses that were hidden, overlooked, or even thrown out of the discourse.
Mm, mm,
This, the other thing is that this dichotomy between East and West, which is a pattern very common in 19th century Orientalism, of
mm,
course, influenced the occult groups in manifolded ways. And it's part of, let's say, a post-colonial look at the history of occultism to uncover this prejudice of East
mm,
and West that
mm,
were really shaping the mindset of those who went to Asia, occultists, and also shaped the mindsets of Indians who were interested in Western occult
mm,
group.
mm, mm, mm,
Important point, I would say. And another point that struck me was that when I studied the Theosophist, this journal of the Theosophical Society, the early issues, uh, I saw that there were many Indian members of the Theosophical Society contribute articles, opinions, few proposing meditation techniques, speaking about yoga and tantra. I had the prejudice that it was the Theosophical Society who entered India and spread the theosophical thought in India. And nobody taught me about Indians contributing to the theosophical movement. And it's influenced by a colonial perspective that the West is always the active part, and the suppressed Indians just receive the messages.
Sounds very Hegelian, like the spirit of history or something like that.
In a way, the history of the theosophical movement was written from that perspective, more or less. So the discovery of the agency of the South Indians in the Theosophical movement is, I think, an important result of Occult South Asia research.
Yeah, Mriganka, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think I would like to draw upon from one of the points that Professor Baier raised, talking about lesser known individuals. So he mentioned Sabhapati Swami, but also in his own article, he mentioned a figure which was not well known at that point, Barodakanta Mojumdar. And Julian Strube later on researched on Barodakanta Mojumdar. Further, Shiv Chandra Biddarnob, as you may know, I researched on Mohini Chatterjee. These were lesser known figures. And I think like making these individuals known again and making them relevant to the global history of occultism is one of the major contributions in a way of the project in general, the Occult South Asia. But also, speaking of post-Orientalist critiques, I think it also gave us new tools, new theories to think about. For example, you were mentioning despatialization. I did think about it for a while, but then I dropped the idea. I haven't wrote anything yet on that. I don't know, maybe in the future. But then later on in my PhD dissertation, while I was working on it, I started thinking in a different frame, which was about capital. And these South Asian ideas, the so-called South Asian ideas, yoga, tantra, were seen as some form of cultural capital. South Asian individuals were seen as some form of social capital. And their contributions, the contributions of Indian religions, Indian thought, Indian individuals, were capitalized in the global religious marketplace. And that's how I built up the theory of theosophical capital. Perhaps we will have time some other day to talk more about it. But I think all of us were devising some kind of post-colonial, post-Orientalist critiques. You talked about translocalization. There are some other scholars who have been doing some other, theoretical interventions in different ways. And these critiques, these new theoretical devices also helped us to break that old East-West binary. It's not just about a dual cultural space, but it's more about a global development pattern. And that's happening through these lesser known historical actors who are very influential in their own contemporary times, but were largely forgotten at the cost of like better known more popular leaders like Blavatsky or Aleister Crowley, or you name it, the Western occultists who were more well known. But there were also lesser known Western figures who worked in India. So it was not just about South Asian historical actors being more prominent, but also several Western historical actors who are working in India, becoming more prominent over there.
Mm.
Uh, so, for example, there was this Viennese homeopath called Leopold Salzar, whom I wrote
Okay.
about.
Oh, interesting.
There are several other figures who were active in India. And I think it's important to talk about these lesser known, the so-called marginalized figures. They were
Mm.
marginalized in terms of their popularity, but we also have to remember they were also socially privileged, whether Indians or Westerners. They came
Mm.
from a very middle class, privileged, financially privileged background, most of them. And they perhaps that also helped them to negotiate their own position within the larger power dynamics of the global exchanges in terms of occultism.
Sure,
And
sure.
I think we need more and more theoretical interventions to problematize these questions about
Mm.
their role and, yeah, the global exchanges in general.
Absolutely. I think it opens up so many questions for further discussion. And I think it's interesting, with some of the emergence of these neglected figures, it seems to me sometimes that entire fields of study have kind of been built on the exclusion of these figures for whatever reason. And so sort of reintegrating them into this space can open so many new questions, right? Mm.
Absolutely.
Well, based on that note, going from kind of this world to the other world in a way, many of the authors and thinkers who were studied as part of Occult South Asia were genuinely interested in claims of a hidden world or reality beyond our normal perception, which is difficult to describe in ordinary language. And that's evident, whether you pick up a book, by a theosophical author or some of the other authors that you mentioned. And, is it helpful in some ways to think of Occult South Asia as a scholarly response to a desire by these authors to expand vocabularies of so-called, Western esotericism to encompass South Asian vocabularies of yoga and tantra? Is it helpful to think of it in terms of the vocabulary basis of these practices rather than just movements? Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this brings into my mind a passage from Isis Unveiled from
Mm.
Blavatsky, where she talks about meditate experiences with meditation and ecstatical experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And she says that, well, we don't have the right words to
Mm.
discriminate the different stages of consciousness that are happening when we practice this meditation techniques and mesmeric practices. And the East, the Sanskrit sources, studied these altered states of mind since centuries, and we have to learn from their vocabulary to see the different stages of consciousness clearer than with what we have already developed in the Western psychology.
Mm.
And that was maybe a basic attitude of occultists traveling to the East,
Mm-hmm.
because they thought that the, the ancient wisdom religion, the occult hidden traditions that really are the holders of truth and deeper secrets, they are more alive in the East, and they did continuously work on these areas of experience, and so they have a better elaborated vocabulary to talk about these unseen worlds.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it brings to mind sort of this idea too that, within these claims, right, if you analyze them deeply, often there are references to, works in, astrology or
Yes.
alchemy or, yoga, these other traditions that it's interesting that, the thread, if you follow it, to some of these conclusions, then it actually can unveil new, patterns of scholarship, like new objects of study as well, that have also been neglected, maybe that are not part of the exchange of Occult South Asia, but that still are underpinning that
Mm,
exchange in some way.
mm,
Hmm.
I think it's a very interesting question,
Mm,
what you raised right now. So expansion of vocabulary, and it reminds me,
mm,
Professor Baier mentioned Isis Unveiled, but it also
mhm,
reminds me of work that was published technically by Blavatsky, but posthumously, called Theosophical Glossary. And
mhm,
if you go through that particular work, you would see words which are mostly South Asian, but also coming from several other parts of the world.
mhm,
And
mhm,
these words entered into the discourse of occultism in the next 150 years. And it included, of course, yoga, tantra, but also chakras,
mhm,
akasa,
mhm,
manas, these kind
mhm,
of words, which you just keep on using in the Western occultist discourses. And then
mhm,
other movements picked those up. OTO picked up some of these terms, maybe. Some other esotericist movements, occultist movements also picked those terms up.
mhm,
So it started with Blavatsky, it started with the Theosophical Society, but also it now did not end there. It continued even during the 20th century through other movements. So the one that comes to my mind right now is the ISKCON,
mhm,
International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So when the founder of ISKCON went to the US, the good old days of West, so-called
mhm,
counterculture, uh, and Hare Krishna became a very popular term. So now
mhm,
you get more new vocabulary, new words in the hippie context. And Krishna worship, uh, basically a very bhakti movement driven, bhakti oriented movement, but it became part of a new rebel consciousness of the United States.
mm,
mhm,
Uh, it happened the other way around as well. So
mhm,
ideas
mhm,
of Wicca, ideas of crystal healing,
mhm,
charms, these kind of ideas entered India
mhm,
in the late 20th, early 21st century with
mm,
liberalization, globalization, privatization of Indian market. And
mhm,
you would find these kind of crystal stones in Indian
mm,
market every now and then. You would find Wiccan groups, small, but still uh, yeah, quite charismatic in their own ways in
mm,
Indian market. You would find new redefinition of baul music,
mhm,
mm,
with where yeah, this happened earlier also when Bob Dylan and Purnadas Baul collaborated. Of course, it happened in a musical context, but then it had its yeah r- resonances in the religious esoteric world. And you would know better than I do about that. You have done so much research on it.
mm,
So I think like new vocabularies were coming up and new ideas were coming up and new terms were developing, which were also becoming giving new tools for a dialogue between
mm,
Euro-American world and South
mm,
Asia, uh,
mhm.
and
yeah,
that was one of the interesting development in this
mm,
in this context, for
Yeah,
sure.
I'm struck too while you're saying this, and I think it's worth adding here to the discussion just to pin this discussion of the entanglement and exchange, is that from the other side, you're right to point out, Mriganko. I'm thinking of, Sabapati Swami, who was mentioned using the word or the phrase occult sciences and mesmerism to talk about, diksha and, other, the samadhi of yoga and so on. And then he's also Telepragada Subbarao adopting this name Solar Sphinx and talking about Gnosticism even before the development of kind of liberalization and so on. Which makes me think that there is a kind of as you were saying, kind of soft capital, theosophical capital, maybe, or other kinds of sort of the power of these words and these vocabularies is certainly present in terms of their understanding power even or their ability to explain things on
mm.
on both sides. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's like what you mentioned about Sabhavati Swami and T. Subbarao. It also
Mm,
reminded me how Tagore was very much interested
mm.
into spiritualism. And when he came across the Ouija board, he had a new name for it, Pret
Okay.
Chakrojan.
Pret
So
Chakraj.
yeah, something like that. I
Pret
might
like ghost, huh? Okay.
yeah, great like host, yeah. So it gave new tools. Spiritualism, also mesmerism, phrenology became very popular in late
Mm,
19th, early 20th century. And also, if you look at the Bengali works of fiction, Bengali literature, you would see several references to spiritualism. I
mm,
have a whole chapter in my PhD dissertation where I discuss about these connections, the reception of Western ideas in Bengali literature. And there are terms of which are of significance in Western esotericism.
mm,
Discourses are used in Bengali literature in some of the
mm,
works.
mm,
So that's
mm,
also fascinating. So new vocabulary coming up, and it's happening in different historical contexts in different time and era.
mhm, mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. Professor Baier, did you have something to add on that?
Yes,
Uh-huh.
an example on the conceptual, more philosophical level is what Bas Jacobs and Lena Kraler found out
Mm,
about the term superconsciousness.
okay.
That superconsciousness was coined as term by the German philosopher Eduard von Hartmann,
Mm,
and that was also taken by Frederick Myers and other parapsychologists, American parapsychologists and psychologists. And finally, it uh, came to Vivekananda, and
mm,
Vivekananda translated samadhi with super consciousness.
mm,
And the term became very popular then. I think also Aurobindo is using it and many
mm,
others. And that the term super consciousness linked modern psychology and yoga terminology in a way that made it possible for Vivekananda to present the Yoga Sutra as a kind of science of the soul,
okay.
yeah, on par with modern psychology. Yeah.
Mm, mm,
So the terminology, the transfer of terminologies is also both sides, from both sides. Yeah.
mm.
Not only
Absolutely.
Indian Sanskrit terms were popularized,
Mm,
also
mm,
English terms were now used in occult Indian writings and yoga writings. So yeah.
mm, mm. Yeah, that's a really important point, and I'm happy that we all have examples. I think we that sounds like something for a future volume or project, actually, with all of these phrases and so on. So, but in the meantime, though, I know that the proceedings from the first Occult South Asia workshop are set to be published in the near future. And
Hmm.
congratulations on that to both of you. What
Thank you.
impact do you hope this volume to have on fields like esotericism and South Asian studies more broadly, Indology? Do you all intend to continue developing this category in the future? Mm,
Well, I think such a publication really helps to make the field more visible
mm, mm,
and contributes to its academic reputation.
mm,
So hopefully, uh, it enriches the amount of people that are interested in this field and may encourage other researchers to continue their work in this area. Personally, I do not expect to pursue further research in this field myself. I have other research interests at the moment.
okay.
But
Like what would you like to share?
what kind of, in recent years, I was more focusing on the late 18th, early 19th century and not so much in occult South Asian
Hmm.
topics, but the origins of psychical research in the late
Hmm.
18th century, this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And it's not so much global oriented like my yoga and meditation studies was. It's more local European studies that are interesting me at the moment.
Okay, yeah, no less important.
Yeah. But I see this publication as important contribution to the ongoing development of the field and of occult studies.
Hmm.
I'm
Hmm.
happy that it finally worked out. We had
Hmm.
of hindrances. Yeah, we had the crisis, the COVID crisis, and
Oh yeah.
several other things. Yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
really made us publishing it so late, which I
Hmm.
really I'm not happy about this, but I'm happy about that it finally happens.
Hmm. Right, occult forces maybe have their own time, right?
Yes.
Hmm. Mriganka, do you have anything to add about the
Yeah,
volume
sure.
and
I
your
mean,
your
yeah.
future?
Well, this is certainly a matter of great honor and pride to work at this project on Occult South Asia. So you congratulated us. We must also congratulate you for contributing to this project and being a very crucial member. And big shout out to all those contributors, all the scholars who have been associated to this project over all
Hmm.
these years and patiently waited uh, for us to carry on with the publication. And this includes, of course, some of the most well-known names in this field of esotericism studies and occult
Hmm.
South Asian research, but also younger scholars, like some of us were at the PhD research stage when
Hmm.
this project started, but then we also eventually uh, moved ahead in our career stages
Hmm.
and continue to research in this direction or different direction. Uh, but yeah, I mean, it really took us a long time, and that's not good. But it's really wonderful that it's coming out. Uh, I would love to see it continue in some form or the other. I do not know whether we will be able to publish this work or not. Uh, yeah, but it's happening in different ways. So for example, your podcast is also one of the ways to continue this initiative. We
Hmm.
still have the Occult South Asia network somewhere there.
Hmm.
We launched it as a thematic network within SV, European Society for Study of Western Esotericism, several years ago.
Hmm.
But it's still not that active, but the network is still there, and maybe some of us can do something at some point. I do not know what, but
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm. Hmm.
I'm sure there will be opportunity if time permits and if we have energetic people around.
Hmm.
Uh, as for my own research, I still continue working, yeah, on esotericism, reception of South Asian religious ideas in the global context. So I also have some interest, new found interest in Tibetan Buddhism,
Hmm.
reception of Tibetan Buddhist thought. So different ideas. Yeah, there are different contexts what can be worked on, and yeah, it would be nice to see the volume coming out
Hmm.
in the near future, in the coming years. So
Hmm.
yeah, we are almost at the end of it, end of the tunnel. So
Hmm.
yeah, very happy
Great.
about that.
Well, I'll certainly promote it and spread it around. I on that note, I had a really great experience last semester teaching a course here at Harvard Divinity School on Occult South Asia, and I can tell you just based on the student interest that it's such a relevant topic even today, and I think that many of the students, it for many of the students, it changed their outlook perceptibly on, academic studies, religious studies in general. And I don't think it was necessarily, the way that I was teaching it. I mean, I certainly, played a role, but the subject itself, I think, is one that can offer a gateway, as you all have been saying, I think, into a more kind of critical perspective on religious studies and so on. So I hope that it continues for that sake. Yeah.
I think we must all collectively do something about it. But of course, like the support that Professor Baier provided us for all these years have been phenomenal. And I must take this
Legendary.
opportunity to
Yes.
thank you, Professor Baier. Like Vienna as a department, that also have been very supportive for this project. So yeah,
And all
so
the
a big
students that have been mentored as well. Too many names to perfectly shout out, but great. Hmm.
But
Well,
yeah, there are enough open questions still to be investigated.
hmm,
So I'm sure that the field will stay alive. Yeah.
hmm,
And
hmm.
your experience at Harvard shows is think is also pointing in this direction.
Sure, sure. Well, on that note, I think we can leave the conversation here. And so, I'm really grateful to you both for taking the time to be on the podcast. And I look forward to seeing where it goes in the future.
Hmm.
Yeah. Vielen Dank. Yeah. Onek
Thank you.
dhanyabad.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, of
Ciao.
course. Thank you.